Hi, I'm Thomas. Are you learning English or maybe another language? Today I had an opportunity to have a conversation with some other teachers about some of the problems that learners face while trying to learn a second language. And one of the problems that language learners often have is finding people to talk to. How can you get more fluent in a language if you don't have opportunities to speak it with people? So that's what we talked about today. Have a listen, and without further ado, here we go.
So I guess students, maybe particularly lower levels, but not exclusively lower levels, they just don't know how. I mean, because it's quite easy to practice listening, it's quite easy to practice reading, it's even conceivably possible to practice writing through finding stuff online. But speaking, it's that one skill that kind of really you need another person, ideally. And I think a lot of learners really struggle in overcoming that. How do I find someone to practice with? How do I manage to do it on my own without someone to practice with? And I guess if a student was listening to this conversation, what might be nice for them is to get some tips and some ideas, because we've probably all got different things that we recommend to our learners. So perhaps collectively, we've probably got 4 times the amount of tips that we would recommend to people, and then hopefully they can kind of find a couple that would match them and be useful for them.
That's a
Right.
good
No, it's
idea.
it's it's interesting. So from my point of view, teaching Esperanto, which is kind of an unusual language to teach, I hear this all the time. People say, "Oh, there's nobody near me who speaks Esperanto, so how can I learn ever to speak it if there's nobody near me? And there's no like one country you can go to speak Esperanto, so how can I do that?" And it's sort of interesting, and sort of in some of the discussions that led up to this, and sort of reflecting on my own experience as a language learner, thinking about how that's a very common experience. Everybody's had that. There's the feeling of somebody who wants to speak a language that's spoken in another country, and nobody near them speaks it. Right? They have a hard time finding people at home who speak, whether it's English or Spanish or whatever languages we're working on. Um, there's that problem. I know myself as a learner of German. Right? I learned German in starting in college, and never lived in a German speaking country.
Mm.
And you on those rare occasions when you bump into somebody who speaks German, they're like, "Oh yes, your your German is very good," and they're but they answer in English, and that's where that's all the practice you can get. So
Hmm.
yeah, I can definitely relate to that feeling.
If I can answer something to what you're saying, Thomas, you as a teacher and you as a learner both, if you want to practice a new language and you talk to them in German and they answer you in English, I had this discussion. I mean, we talked about it once with a friend. He's American and he was learning Spanish,
Yep.
and we were having lunch, and suddenly I was talking to him in English because at some point it's like I have a switch that I don't
Yep.
control if I don't pay attention to it. So I hear English, I immediately speak English. And he got angry because he was talking to the waiter in Spanish and the waiter answered him in English, and then he was like, why do people do that all the time? I want to practice my Spanish. And I say,
Right.
don't get angry, just say so.
It happens to me too. Like as you
Yeah,
as
because
you know,
it's
like
like we have a switch and we don't control it sometimes. And the only thing I would say is just say it that you want to practice your Spanish, and people will, I think they will gladly change to practice the other language with you.
Right.
but there's like practical reasons why they don't do that. For example, I've been living in Romania for 2 years now, and even though my like Romanian is pretty good, I still make a lot of mistakes. And when people communicate with me and I communicate with them in Romanian, sometimes it's difficult for me to get certain messages across. And they say want to switch to English, or they just switch to English because they know that I'm American. And I get kind of frustrated because one, sometimes I want to practice, and two, it makes me seem stupid because they're like, "Oh,
Yep.
you're too stupid to communicate our language. Like, speak
No,
your language."
you don't need to take it that way. You're a learner. You're learning a new language. In that case, Romanian is your second language. So if they ask you, do you want to switch to English? Say no. I'm trying to learn, and I would prefer if you help me correct my Romanian.
That's true.
I think
And like I shouldn't
Yeah,
take
to
it
be honest and to say what you want, I think it's better than actually.
I know what you're saying,
You
and like I
you're
shouldn't take it.
building up in the end.
Yeah, and I shouldn't take it personally, I know. But regardless, it takes willpower for me to like say every single time, I insist. And I have to be very mindful of that, and it just takes more energy in general.
Hmm.
Yeah, but I mean, for example, you can say that to the closest people to you. Like, I would always rather to speak German and Romanian, and I would always rather if you corrected me instead of actually if you helped me instead of actually switching to English.
I actually,
I'm not getting frustrated because you're not stupid. You're just learning.
hmm I want to come back to what Sarah was talking about, like giving out tips for students that want to get more conversational practice. What kind of tips might you guys have for that?
So one thing I always tell people is all the language skills that we have. The language is not one skill. It's a set of skills, and every one of them takes practice, right? So, um, to be able to have a conversation in real time, you have to understand what the person's saying. You have to think about, do I have anything relevant to add here? Do I have the vocabulary? Right? And can I string all these words together, and can I pronounce them? And can I make my mouth make those sounds? And by the time we try to pay attention to all these things at once, if it's something that we're new at, we can't we're not we can't focus on everything all at once. So I encourage people to break things down. And one thing that we can do, even if there is nobody near us that speaks our target language, is to read out loud, right? Because that lets us focus on this last part of the whole thing. How do I make my mouth make these sounds? And so by reading, literally taking a book or a Kindle or whatever you kids read on these days, taking it and just physically reading out loud, you're training your mouth to make these sounds so that when you do get in that situation, your mind doesn't have to focus on that part of language production. And then also you're able to sort of hear yourself speaking, so it helps you get used to the sounds as well. So I think reading out loud is something I would
But how do they know
encourage
they're pronouncing the
people
words
to do if
correctly?
they feel like they don't. Ah, that's another good question. But again, it's a set of skills, right? So that shouldn't be the only thing you're doing. You should also be listening to videos or audio samples and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
They can, if you've got students who've got graded readers, a lot of graded readers come with audio files.
Hmm.
They're fantastic, so they can listen and read at the same time. They can choose even just a little paragraph, record themselves reading that aloud, and then compare themselves to the recording, and that immediately gives feedback on whether the pronunciation has been okay, whether they've broken the chunks of the speech appropriately, because that's something a lot of learners have trouble with. So
Mm-hmm.
definitely reading aloud is great, and if you've got something to make that comparison with, that's even better, definitely.
But doesn't that take a lot of time? They have to read it, and then they have to listen, and then they have to do it again, and then listen.
But learning a language takes a lot of time, so yeah,
Okay.
it takes time, but having a conversation takes time. Doing anything properly takes time. I think quick fixes when it comes to language learning are a little bit of a tricky one. I don't know. I'm not sure they really exist, and they don't. Even if it's a tiny paragraph, I'm not suggesting to read and record a whole page, but a little bit. It's enough to give you some good feedback.
Mm-hmm. If I were a student and I'm looking just to practice speaking, for example, like when I want to practice my Romanian more, which I could always use more practice of, I'm not necessarily looking for like the best teacher or the person that's 100% knowledgeable on every single grammar rule and all that stuff. More or less, I'm looking for someone that's just willing to correct me if I make like really obvious mistakes and tell me how I should pronounce things if I mispronounce things. But I'm not necessarily looking for like super crazy grammar like guru. I'm like for me at least, it's more important that I get into like the mindset of thinking in Romanian, speaking in Romanian, getting used to saying things in Romanian, communicating certain messages in Romanian, more than getting bogged down by grammar. And I feel like most students like focus too much on grammar instead of like actually practice speaking.
I completely
You know, I
agree.
have, yeah.
Thomas, go for it.
Oh yeah, I was going to say I have mixed feelings on that. I have some students who are not at all interested in grammar. They just want to jump in and do speaking practice. And a lot of times it depends on the level. And I do. There definitely are people that focus too much on the grammar. Um, but yeah, I think in that case, from my perspective, there's a mixed bag.
So how do you find a balance between your grammar exercises and the speaking exercises with your students?
So again, it depends on the language I'm working on. German, I focus specifically on grammar, and so I tell my students that that they should be seeing what I do with them as one part of their language learning, right? They should continue to, if they're following a book, to follow the book, or look for somebody for some conversation practice, for more of a like an immersion type experience. Um, and I think it's to me one of the most thrilling things. Uh, and I always feel funny telling people this because I teach online, but the um, I started teaching online. Just somebody suggested it, and I said, "Oh, I'll try it." And so I have fallen in love with this format because it's an opportunity, and just in the blink of an eye, you can be face to face with somebody who speaks the language you want to learn. You don't have to go anywhere. You don't even have to drive to across town and pay $5 for a cup of coffee. You can just have somebody right there. Um, whether it's a tutor that you're working with online, somebody you're paying, or a language partner. Um, I've had some good experience with language partners. The trick the difficult thing is agreeing on a schedule. I've had people reach out to me and they say, "Do you want to do a language partnership?" And I'm like, "Yeah, that sounds great. When do you want to do it?" And they never come up with it. They never even come up with the time, right?
So
So
scheduling is
it's
hard.
scheduling is hard, but and so you got to make that balance. If you do you want to pay a teacher or a tutor to spend some time with you for conversation practice, or do you want to spend your time trying to set up the schedule? And to me, that's a practical question that has different answers for different people. But what I actually, and this is another question that was on my mind as I was thinking about this session, is one of my students asked me recently. He's like, "Well, how often should I take lessons with you?" And I told him, well, this is the answer I gave him. I said, really depends on what you want to do. If you're comfortable learning on your own, and you're driving your own learning plan, and you just want to check in once a week or whatever to make sure that, like Johnny was saying, make sure your pronunciation is correct, right? And to get that one-on-one feedback, that would be fine. But I wonder if anybody has any thoughts about how to answer that question.
The frequency?
Yeah, frequency.
Yeah, I would love to answer that. So I have students that take lessons once a week and some that take up to three a week. And based on what I've observed, taking a lesson with me, each lesson is 1 hour long. Taking a lesson with me once a week kind of prevents them from digressing into a worse situation as far as speaking English. Taking two, like, presents some improvement. Taking three a week, like, significant improvement. I've seen my student that takes 3 lessons a week improve really quickly. In the course of, I think I've been teaching him for 3 months now. He's gone from he moved up. I would say from like a B to a C level in terms of speaking English.
Right.
So I guess frequency depends on the student how much they want to improve and how quickly.
Hmm.
Yeah, I agree with you in that one. I would say that the more they practice, like anything, the better they get. So of course, if they are trying to improve conversation, definitely the more lessons, the more they will their knowledge will stick to them, right? And once they learn
Mm-hmm.
something, it's still fresh in their heads if they have a new lesson only 2 days later instead of as opposed to 1 week later when they already forget that. So for conversation, I think that that would be the more the better.
Yeah, I do think there's a practical limit for most people. So how about other ways to find opportunities to practice, like maybe locally? Um, are there good ways to find and bad ways to find local practice
Some
opportunities?
cities have. I mean, obviously, maybe not now, right now, because of the coronavirus, but certainly where I live, there are actual live physical language exchanges, where people
Hmm.
from sometimes they're targeted. So it could be, hey, Spanish speakers, come and improve your English with English speakers that want to learn Spanish. But some of them are actually genuinely international, and you can, where I live, there happens to be a very large foreign student population anyway, and there are language programs, language exchanges, which are free. In the evenings, people can come and get together and just have a chat. And I would imagine that in quite a lot of big cities globally, that's something which is possible. And that's brilliant, because that gives you, because the thing about speaking with a teacher, if you're having a speaking lesson with your teacher, it's not the same as just having a chat with someone who is your equal in a cafe, because
Hmm.
when you're speaking with a teacher, it's always, that teacher's listening, and that you're going to get some feedback, and it's a little bit more anxiety making. So I think informal speaking practice, whether you find that online through Facebook, because there's a lot of Facebook groups where people post requests for speaking partners, particularly for exams, or whether you find that in person in your city, I think that's a fantastic way for people to improve their speaking.
That calls to mind another thought that I have in terms of one thing I see a lot when people look for speaking opportunities is they say, "Hey, who can help me with my English?" Right? And it's always important to think about when you're asking that, what are you offering that other person?
Yeah.
And I wonder about. I mean, I live in an area where there are a lot of Spanish speakers, and I I have not looked into this very hard, but I always wonder what if I sort of showed up at a Sunday morning, I don't know, Spanish church or something. Why would they want to talk to me, right? So there's that question. Or why would a native speaker come to a cafe on a Tuesday night, right? Unless they wanted to get something out of that exchange as well. So we need to think in terms of what we're bringing to other people when we ask them for help.
Yeah, anytime you do any sort of exchange, you gotta be able to offer something of equal or greater value in return. Which is why money makes it easy, right? Just pay people.
Hmm.
I think Sarah's comment is interesting because that's another thing. Is that it's easy enough to find language partners, and some language partners have more experience with language partnerships than others, and um, and there are also different kinds of tutors that you can find online, and they have different levels of experience with that sort of thing. And I think a lot of it comes down to what kind of feedback do you want? Do you want to have that equal level conversation, um, or do you want to get that feedback?
Speaking of
Um,
feedback, that reminds me that, like, for example, if you were to speak a non-native language with another non-native speaker, then you run the risk of picking up on some of their pronunciation mistakes.
But you run that risk either way. Even if I get an English tutor, let's say English tutor, not professional teacher, according to the platform categories, right? You run that risk anyways. I know a lot of my friends, they have university diplomas and everything, and they use their conditional wrong in Spanish.
mhm.
Mm-hmm.
So you might get mistakes from native speakers too, if they
True.
don't know the language. I have a friend, she always pronounces extra S's everywhere where they shouldn't be. And again, she is a business administrator with a university diploma. She's also a lawyer, and she still adds S's to lots of words that shouldn't have S's.
That's true.
So imagine, I always imagine this. looking for an exchange partner or a tutor that is not actually a real teacher, and suddenly learning their mistakes.
Mm-hmm. Um, the thing with that though is like if I were a student, it's more like just probability speaking. If I were to get a speaking partner, the probability that, someone is gonna make less mistakes if they're a native speaker, um, it's just going to work out that way. But if they're not native, chances are they will probably make more mistakes than a native speaker. That's just my impression.
I think this all speaks to the importance of having a mix of inputs. I had one student that was taking daily lessons with me for a while, and his English was really improving very fast. And one day I was listening to him. I'm like, oh my gosh, he sounds like me. Right? He uses the words that I use that are peculiar to my own way of speaking,
Yeah.
and right. And I finally had to tell him. I said, I say fella all the time. Right? There's this fella learning English with me, and I'm like, well, it's not a super rare word, but it's not a very common word either. And so I one thing is I stopped using that word with my students, but I also encourage them, make sure you're talking to other people as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think students should be exposed to a variety of teachers so that they can kind of pick and choose what kind of things to pick up from each one. But I think students are afraid of, rotating through students, and there's not really an easy way of doing that
Hmm.
because they have to make sure the student's the right fit for them every time and
Yep.
that sort of stuff. There's a startup cost to that.
Well, I think going back to what Sarah was saying, that you can spend some time with a teacher and some time with a language partner and some time at a cafe and some time just reading out loud to get that whole mix of
Yeah,
different ways of getting that input and practice.
it's like having a balanced diet. I think,
Yeah,
if you have lessons with regular lessons with a proper teacher who does give you that feedback and does keep you accurate and does keep you kind of improving without getting too messy with things. But if that's then supplemented with chatting, because it's so important, like to actually just chat and put things into use and to make mistakes and to experiment. And I think it's hard for learners to do that in front of their teachers. I think it's much easier to do that in front of peers because it's a safer space. But obviously, you do need that kind of professional ear to keep check on what's going on, because if you don't have that at all, if you only learn through chatting with people, um my experience of working with people who have learned English through chatting only is that they might sound very fluent superficially, but the second that you start digging into their language, it's full of mistakes. And the problem is also they've been learning that way for so long that those mistakes become extremely hard to eradicate. So
Yeah.
I think Thomas is right. A balance really is what the best way
yeah,
forwards.
and balance is important also. This is a little bit going back to your nativeness, the nativeness you mentioned before. Yeah, probably a native teacher would be a lot better, definitely, than a non-native teacher in that sense, because at some point they will correct maybe probably more mistakes. But we also need to understand that we live in a global world nowadays in which everybody speaks English. The Italian, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Argentinian, the everybody speaks English with a different accent, and we need to be able to understand all of them as well, with their mistakes and everything. The health, what is it? The World Organization, World
World Health
Health
Organization.
Organization. Yeah, I forget the letters. So this guy, I think he is from Greece, from somewhere in the Middle East. I don't know. He does have an accent, and he still has an amazing exposed job in which he speaks English with an accent.
Yep.
And we need to still understand him. If he makes mistakes or if he has pronunciation things that are different from a native speaker, we still need to understand him. He's saying important things. So I think accents should not become only American or British. Everybody speaks English with a different accent. So your accent is not the most important thing as long as you're pronouncing your words correctly. And that kind of things that kind of exposure you get with other learners. For example, if I practice I'll give you a second. If I practice my Spanish or my English or my French with another learner, they will have an accent. I might not get a perfect accent, but that student will point me out what he learned, what his teacher taught him, and will give that feedback to me as well, I think. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't see that as a disadvantage.
I wanted to touch on that point that you said, how accent is not the most important thing. However, I can't like deny the fact that it leaves a certain kind of first impression if you have a certain kind of accent. I mean, if if you have like a regional accent and some people have associated your accent with a certain type of, association that might be bad. I'm not going to name any specifics, but there are certain accents where people like associate like stupid or uneducated or whatever. And some people have those accents, they want to get rid of them. I can see why it's important, because for example, when I speak Romanian, I learned Romanian from my parents who are more from the country than the city. So I speak with that regional accent. And when I say some words, people laugh or chuckle. And I'm just like, shut up, stop laughing, It's frustrating. And I'm sure.
But I think that is something you should be working on personally, because that is something that makes you feel inferior somehow. That is your own feeling. I learned English. I learned a little bit of Chinese. I learned French. And when I speak with my stupid, ridiculous, funny accent, I laugh at myself. I get laughed at in Buenos Aires when I speak with my regional Neuquinian accent. I do have an accent in Argentina, and they laugh at me, and I laugh with them because I do have my accent. It's my accent. It doesn't make me stupid. I still do have a university diploma. I still do know how to speak English and French and Chinese and Spanish.
I agree, but like you can't
I
really
don't feel
alter.
stupid. It's just my accent.
I agree, but you can't really alter a person's first impression of you. And if I go to a networking event, I speak Romanian, and then they hear me speak and they automatically associate stupid with me and how I speak, it's going to be very difficult for me to change that. And so, from a practical aspect, I just don't want to have to deal with that issue in the first place.
Yeah,
That is
yeah.
very much in your head. I'm sorry.
Well,
I don't
it's
think people are, maybe, for example, in North America, you would laugh at an accent, a Texas accent, or a, I don't know, Alabama accent. I don't know. I wouldn't.
yeah. It
We
definitely
all have a
depends
way of
on what your
speaking.
goals are. Right. So one of what I tell people about accents, especially in Esperanto, because people often come to Esperanto saying there is no such there's no such thing as an Esperanto accent, and actually there is. But specific, thinking more about English, what maybe some of you guys are more familiar with. It depends on what your goals are. I had one student come to me, and he was getting ready for an interview at an international company with an international boss from a different country, and none of them were native English speakers, and he just wanted the opportunity to be able to speak comfortably. So he was practicing, brushing up on his English because he wanted to be comfortable, so he could focus on the content of his interview and not how to say it in English. But for somebody else who was going to an interview with an American company with American bosses who have little exposure to other accents, you want to make that good first impression. You want people to focus on what you're saying and not how you're saying it. So it really, I think it depends on what your goals are.
Yeah, the better you speak, the better, of course. But it doesn't mean that if you have an accent, you're speaking badly. My former president in Argentina, he spoke in English, perfect grammar, with a little bit of an accent, and he was the president of the country, Argentina, but the president of the country. So
I can see why you're like enthusiastic or positive about how an accent might not negatively impact people. But I've seen it happen to me. But on top of this, I also used to follow this YouTuber called Nast Daily, and he's like a vlogger, and he put out a video where he explained his accent because he's not from the United States, but he has a very American accent. He said that when he was young, he practiced pronouncing things like native speakers so that people would perceive him in a certain way. And after I saw that, I was like, yep, that's true.
I live in Valencia. It's very cosmopolitan, believe it or not. Lots of people from everywhere. And I wanted to practice French. So I went to one of the expats group in Valencia and asked anyone there want to practice French. Let's meet up for a picnic, for a talk, and let's exchange French and Spanish, and that worked.
I always get my students to record themselves. So almost everyone's got a smartphone these days. Um, they can, if obviously if they're doing an exam like IELTS or FCE, they've got specific tasks that they can record. If they're just learning general English, they might, it could be like Thomas's reading aloud thing, or it could be that they take a tiny little clip from a TV show, whatever, but record it, listen to it, find the problems, and do it again. Because I think for most learners who are learning online, the ability to self-reflect on their own language is super, super important going forwards.
I agree. Self-reflection, super good tip.
Yeah, so I think my number one tip, if you can't find people near you to practice your language, is to practice pronunciation out loud. Whether there's somebody there listening or not, and then also make sure you have lots of opportunities to listen. And then finally, if you can, find a language partner or occasional contact with a tutor. That's how I'm continuing to work on German. And yeah.
Yeah, I guess
In
my
that sense, I'm sorry.
Go
If
ahead.
I could add one more thing that I just saw, based on the recording thing you were saying, Sarah, or you, Thomas, said before as well. Um, our lessons can be recorded. So, for example, if we are teaching pronunciation, if we are teaching something very conversational, they can record their classes and they can listen to them again to see, oh, let's see how she did it. Let's see what she corrected, so they can check it out. Self-reflection again, recording the classes.
Yeah, I guess my tip would be to try to find opportunities to speak that language in different situations, like maybe a board game meetup. If a board game group plays board games and they speak the language you're trying to learn, go there and learn the language through playing games. Maybe you're not forced to speak as much, and you can see how people interact with that language in that way. Or maybe go to meetups where people speak that language, like social events and sort of stuff like that. And but now it's kind of hard because of the pandemic. But anyway,
They're still doing those meetups online.
true.